sick or debilitated country, it's going to be affected worse. So that's why, for two reasons, we really need to get our guard up. We have a dual burden of disease. We have enough communicable diseases, and this virus has even actually multiplied it 10 times over. And in addition to that, we have the lifestyle diseases. So our budget outlay has to increase. So I think there are a few things that did happen in the budget. That is, mainly, more human sort of face stuff like the health ecosystem portal, the mental health portal, the skill development portal. So these are things that have contributed in some ways, but really not materially. So I think that we need to get down to brass tacks in the sense of how do we build our stack of healthcare so that in times to come we can be very sort of nimble on our feet to deal with situations like we had. So that's, I think, is the overall, I think needle didn't move enough, that's hard to say.
Okay, well, coming from, a sector like healthcare, where Dr. Trihan, as you're saying, the needle didn't move enough, to a sector such as hospitality, where I think they're likely to say the needle didn't move at all. Puneet, I know it's a sector that's seen a lot of pain, and the consensus would be that somehow the government has ignored the sector, not really acknowledged the kind of pain. There have been no incentives, nothing to encourage things to move.
Consensus is definitely on something else. Let's say there is a terminology used by a very famous business school called wisdom of the crowds. If I look at the collective wisdom of the crowds, everybody is applauding the budget, right? So I also believe that the budget is very good, looking at that helicopter view. The second is tourism and hospitality sector is really a beneficiary indirectly from several things, several steps that are being taken in the budget. As an example, infra spending. If there are more train stations, if there are more airports, if there are more highways, then we tend to be a beneficiary in this sector. If there is more ease of doing business, we're also a beneficiary. If more employment is created, there is more disposable income, there are more people dining out, then we are also a beneficiary. So that's one way of looking at it, which is very optimistic. Where I think we are missed out is in opportunity. We are India at 75. We are not a newly independent nation. We are not a poor country. We are not even like a country into growth mode. We are a country which is considered at the top in many of the sectors that we speak about. And I think giving this industry, especially for lower level of projects, infrastructure status, does not cost anything. But it would have encouraged more capital inflow coming into the sector over the next years. Including it in the concurrent list of constitution aligns how the center and state would have worked. And after 75 years of being independent, I think it can be included in the concurrent list, and it will help. I think there are some of those things which did not, because budget is at the end of the day a P&L, and these kind of things don't go through the P&L, so these are easier to do. The sector definitely has shown a lot of character. This is the sector that has bravely paid all taxes, all rents, all statutory obligations, although they were put in a lockdown. So I think some kind of empathy, a little bit more empathy would have been good. Having said that, one could also say that it got referred in the budget speech several times, and we got 50,000 crores as ECLGS scheme, and maybe there will be some improvements on the moratorium and the extension. So all in all, I think something, opportunity, yes, we could have done more. And very important for a country, that this sector globally creates more than 10% of the jobs. is accountable for more than 10% to the GDP. In India, the figures were more like 7%, but if you take the indirect impact of the informal sector, then you're talking about more than 12% of employment. That's your shikara guy on the Dal Lake or the rickshawala in Banaras from Kashi Vishwanath temple to the Ghat. I think all these people, anybody, it's an airport rep at the airport, it's a travel agent for whom a business is shut for 2 years because airports are shut. It's not anybody's fault, but I think there are a lot of people whose lives and livelihoods are dependent on this sector, and I think things will happen and more will come, maybe outside of the budget. But yes, it's an opportunity missed, at least in terms of positioning of the sector.
Okay, so coming to a sector now which can't complain about mentions in the budget, but infrastructure clearly took center stage this time. And yet there were questions, Vinayak. There were questions about implementation, execution, projects that have been stalled. Will things pick up? Will the spending actually happen? How do you view the budget?
Abha, I think your viewers must have now digested the fact of a 7.5 lakh crores and a 35% increase in outlay. And then everybody says, so infrastructure has got this much. I think it's important at this session to possibly use this occasion to explain an underlying philosophy. See, here is an economy that was down -8, -9% because of the COVID impact. And it has to rapidly clamber up, right? To do all the things which we want done, jobs, growth, employment, all of that. So, there are two schools of economists. There is one school of economists who say that the best way to do it is to put money directly into the hands and pockets of the consumer. So, if you follow that school, then you would be doing things like personal income tax cuts, increase in subsidies, reduction in taxes, direct benefit transfer, universal basic income, all these measures that economists talk about, then put money directly into the hands of the people. That's one extreme. The other extreme of the spectrum is purely Keynesian, not in terms of what Keynes said that just dig ditches and fill them up, but in terms of creating lasting capital assets for the nation. And therefore, you achieve the same thing by spending this kind of outlay in infrastructure. At one stroke, it creates demand for intermediates, steel, cement. It employs an army of workers, not just in the cities, but across Bharat. And they in turn get salaries and wages, and they start doing the kind of things like dining out at Taj, etc., etc. Now, the important thing is, in the past, we have waffled. We have done a little of this and a little of that, a little from this side of the spectrum, a little from that side of the spectrum. And what I want to tell you and your viewers today is that the session a little before this, when Dr. Somnathan was here, he made a very pointed, he shared a very pointed statistic, which is that studies have now documented that 1 rupee spent on infrastructure leads to 3 rupees growth in GDP. 1 rupee spent as a revenue expenditure, as a dole or as a giveaway or as a non-asset creating expenditure, gives 0.9 of GDP. So if you now stand back and look at the perspective, I laud and appreciate the government for its consistency and clarity of thought by saying, yes, some economists would argue direct benefit transfer is good, some would say this, but we don't have the luxury of staring at the water and contemplating. We have to act, and we have to act on the 1st of February. So they have acted, they have chosen the path of high expenditure on infrastructure, which has that 3 multiple, and I think we are all waiting now to see the results, some of which will be short term, some will be medium term, but hopefully that's the right path, and the large infrastructure outlays then rest on this economic philosophy. And I think that's the important point.
Okay, I'll get Puneet's view on that. But Dr. Trehan, let me bring you in here and also understand, sure, this, the spending was cut back. The government justified it in lots of press post the budget, saying that, they had a peak or a lift in spending on healthcare, the worst of it in the second wave, and so it was prudent or rational to trim it a bit. They'll again extend it should the situation arise. But also incentives. There was nothing on, in terms of SOPs for spending on R&D, incentives to try and make premium healthcare a little bit more affordable, for example, in a country like ours, premium private healthcare. Are there other steps they could have taken, and how do you see the impact on the individual?
So if you look at it historically, there has been very little help coming from the government to the private healthcare providers. In the sense they think that you are out there and you'll somehow take care of things yourself. But there are some things that can be done to stimulate the creation of high-level healthcare in Tier 2, Tier 3 cities, which has been one of the things that we have been talking about, that we are able not only to create the infrastructure, but we do have the human capital to be able to actually man it and train enough people to go forward with it. So there are two parallels running here, the government system and the private private still is dominant in the sense numerically, and the services and the level of medicine also in the private sector is quaternary in some areas. So if the government in its wisdom felt that to build out that infrastructure in the Tier 2, Tier 3 cities, which is sorely needed, that we have been saying that we should be put in the national priority sector. So that if it's that way, then supposedly you're able to access funds at a lower price, which will help or encourage private sector to actually create more and more in the rural areas. So that's one. So if you look at our indicators, health indicators, they are very dismal. I mean, we are somewhere 148th or something in the ranking. Bangladesh, Nepal, even Sri Lanka, all these people have a much higher allocation in their budgets. So whatever, I mean, the wisdom is, the basic thing is there are some good things did happen. Ayushman scheme has been a boon to at least, I mean, not enough people have accessed it yet because there was some money left over in the last year. But that effort is on how to identify those people who are actually deserving of it, where else a lot of people who are not have occupied that space because, you know, our general habit. So I think over a period of time, all that will equalize. I think we are on the right path, but I think the allocations have to be much higher. And health sector, private health providers proved their mettle in the last wave, right? So, and there was a lot of breakdown of barriers between private and government health services. And I think if that spirit continues, we'll see a much better, well-coordinated, less cost healthcare coming forth in the next 3 to 5 years.
Okay, fantastic. Puneet, I saw you looking to reply or to contribute when Vinayak was making his point. Do you see growth coming back on the back of the infra push in terms of demand, growth, income growth, and spending?
Let me first, agree to something which Vinayak said is very important. In any business, anywhere in the world, clarity and consistency is the most important pillar for anything that is sustainable. So I do believe that clarity and consistency has been there. Now, with demand and growth coming back, it all depends who you talk to and how you calculate the percentages. When you're coming from a low, the percentage level looks very high. Now, when you are at a high, then trying to achieve 8-9% is not that easy. And there I would say that the investment, for example, in infrastructure is an important investment. That's why I was also asking that if you give hospitality sector just infrastructure status for projects as of 25 crores, it doesn't cost you anything. But each of that rupee spent in will create employment on the site, then creates employment when the project is finished, creates indirect employment of people supplying milk, butter, vegetables, meat, whatever to the properties. So I think that's what I was thinking. But growth definitely will come over several centuries, if not decades. Indian subcontinent has proven its resilience, and there is no reason why it should not bounce back strongly this time. And I actually feel the growth here might be stronger than anywhere else in the world.
That's always wonderful to hear.
I have to, coming from hospitality, if it's not strong, the disposable income is not there. We need that money to be spent in hotels again.
Absolutely. Vinayak, tell us what is the other fine print according to you? You know, yes, they talked about infrastructure. Yes, we know the takeaway is there. What more would you have liked to see?
I think a large portion of the budget discussions is number driven, and that's now well established, 35% increase and all that. What's important in this budget is there has been a significant reset of the playing field between private sector and government. There has been a re-engagement of the terms of engagement. And I'll tell you some of the stuff that I noticed in the budget. The most important was the finance minister herself coming out openly talking about a circular that has not received attention, I'm sorry to say, by the media, including by Indian industry, called the 29th October notification that resets the entire public procurement rules, the most dramatic being payment in 10 days' time. When people hear it, they fall off their chairs. So that 29th October circular is one of the most important reforms where the terms of engagement has come in favor of the private sector. There has been an announcement of a product called surety bonds. Indian businessmen working in infrastructure have a major pain point with bank guarantees, right? And we've cribbed like hell about bank guarantees. Now the insurance sector is stepping in with a similar product called surety bonds. That removes a pain point. She's talked about resetting PPP and levelizing the playing field and better risk allocation. She's announced capacity building measures for all towns and cities, urban local bodies, so that infra projects in towns and cities can happen, and maybe next year or the budget thereafter you're going to see a big announcement, catch me then, called municipal bonds, a new capital market instrument. Now I can go on, and there is a new international arbitration center in Gift City, Ahmedabad. So there are five, six more points, but the broad point I want to leave you with is beyond the outlays, this budget stands out for a significant rearrangement of the terms of engagement between private sector and government, with the favor going to the private sector. So broadly, private sector is very happy with all these developments.
Okay, would you both concur? And there have been analysts saying that the finance minister has done a wonderful job in striking the right balance, fiscal prudence and spending this time around. Would you agree, Dr. Trehan?
No, like you said, it's a forward-looking budget. Its good part is that it's long-term, which sets out the roadmap for India. But what I don't agree is that, there is so much immediate distress at the bottom of our whole society that some relief to them. So you balance off long term, like you're saying, 7 lakh crores or 7.5. If you had taken away maybe 6.5 lakh crores and redistributed some of the money, and so that would be immediate. Now what Mr. Chatwal is talking about, by the time it goes through the full cycle of the design, tendering, building, all that stuff, and the labor coming on site, it may be a year or 2 or 3 for all you know, because at every step there is a PIL file that you can't go through this land, you are disturbing the ecology, and it's true also. So infrastructure is not easy to build rapidly. So the money, I don't think it will be spent. Basically, a lot of it will be left behind. So it could have been actually distributed in many other ways. So I think relief is required today, not promise of next 2 years, because those poor people have suffered already for 2 years. If you look at the misery at the bottom, it is huge. People are, when we talk about this portal on mental health, I think it's sorely needed because there's so many people in distress. They don't even know where the next meal is coming from. What are you talking about roads coming? So I think that could have been done without increasing the deficit or anything like that. A redistribution of this would have helped. So if increasing the healthcare by 16,000, you could have made it 30,000. Then you would have moved the needle. This way it really didn't, because it just went for inflation, that's all. So I think that's the balance I would say is missing.
Well, and we will, of course, pose that question to the finance minister as well. We have been talking a lot about the K-shaped recovery and what kind of challenges that poses for the recovery. Puneet, the larger unorganized sector, they had to first deal with the implementation of GST, then demonetization, and then COVID. There is a lot of pain in the unorganized sector in MSMEs at this point of time. Tell us, as captains of industry and you see this on ground, what is the ground reality?
It is quite tough, as Dr. Trehan said. I mean, there are people who are suffering, and nobody knows better than a doctor does, because he has to treat the patient. And this sector has been a very difficult patient to be treated. I think, as we said, people lost their lives, livelihoods, and many people live on what they earn on the same day. And if the sector is shut, they have had no income, so till how long can you subsidize? You have to have a system. I also agree with finding the balance between the immediate and the long-term strategy, because the country is heterogeneous. So of course there have to be certain steps taken in that direction. However, if you think long-term, then yes, some things will change, will have to change, and there will be no other choice, because that's how nations are positioned and have to be competitive on all fronts. So I think, and that's what I said at the outset, eventually many of the things will happen maybe outside of the budget, because budget is not the only instrument available with the government.
No, and that has been a hallmark of this government in terms of making announcements and taking measures through the year. Ritesh, welcome.
Thank you for having me here, and hi everyone. Sorry about the delay. This is just, I'm really sorry about it.
So this is a side of the panel which is sharing some criticism and complaint, and that is the side of the panel that has a lot to be upbeat about. So clearly some of the buzzwords in the budget were digital, startups. I think if we look at the word cloud, these were some of the most often used words. Why was that, a positive sign to you? Of course, you run one of the country's biggest startups, but in terms of a startup in the hospitality sector, there were different factors at play.
Yeah, look, I think, I'm lucky to be in a place where I get to see two very interesting segments. One is, of course, the startup new age world of technology. And on the other side, similar to my friend Puneet, on the hospitality side of the world, of course, in a very different segment and very different set of consumers and merchants. I think this year, as I was looking at the budget, I just almost every few lines, I could see the word digital being used. So I think one thing that is consistent about, the budget for the last few years at least, is digital is no more something that is being seen as a potential use case. It is here to stay, and it is here to make sure that every use case for the citizen in terms of services, digital will play a part of it. And in my perspective, if you see, the outcome of this is companies like us and many others, which are the unicorns over the last few years, can create great digital infrastructure to build on top of it. That's the first one. The second, I think, like Puneet was mentioning, in the hospitality ecosystem, clearly the last 2 years have been extremely challenging. Nobody can take away from it. But at the same time, one of the things that we've seen is COVID has also led to some opportunities. So if you look at leisure tourism, especially road trips, that is probably at its peak. Like, I have never seen people driving nearby as much as they have done recently. So investment in road infrastructure, airport infrastructure, rail infrastructure, while it may feel like it's going to benefit mostly the infrastructure construction companies, but remember, infrastructure is one of those opportunities which creates an impact in all of our businesses. So in my view, while clearly there is a lot that needs to be done, I think, especially the focus on digital and infrastructure, I think is a long-term bet to growth.
So let me ask you this, and everyone's asking, how come all the money is going to these new economy startups and not to the old economy business that are in fact starved for capital? They're looking to raise capital. A lot of them still have debt, even though there's been such a cleanup over the last couple of years. But how would you answer that? The FM herself alluding to this year in the budget and the kind of capital that's been generated by startups.
So first off, I'll tell you this, that nobody is complaining about capital. Not just the new age companies, even the well-run legacy companies, they've all been able to raise significant amount of capital very well. But that said, look, clearly growth everybody wants to be a part of well-run growth opportunities around ourselves, right? And India is a great example. India is increasing its expenditure by, I think, 35% this year. The world's money is coming to India. So clearly, a lot of the new age companies are driving growth. They're becoming systemic to what the future of our country will be like, especially in COVID showed us this, right? You needed healthcare support. There was, of course, the hospital infra, but I think Dr. Trehan himself and their teams were enabling digital support for people around themselves. India is creating such a large healthcare support ecosystem around ourselves in eSwasthya. So my perspective is that growth driven by becoming systemic are the reasons why new age companies are attracting a lot of capital. I can, I'm a believer, so I can give you 10 other reasons, okay. But I think these two will be at the top of the list.
So let me pose a question to both of you. There was a conversation with Dr. Subramaniam earlier, and he mentioned in the backdrop of what he said was a fairly well done budget, that there's still a reason why we're not seeing the kind of private capex and the kind of foreign capex entering the country. He said there's still work to be done. How would you take that? What would be your response to that?
So what he actually alluded to was on one thing, that COVID actually put so much stress on the system that there was no money in the system, right? The banks were already under stress, and so was the private sector. But now that is all actually the intervention done by the Reserve Bank and all that did help, of course. So we are now, as far as domestic capital is concerned, at least the accessibility is much better today than it was 2 years ago. That's for sure. Now, as far as foreign capital is concerned, I know very little about it, so I will not even profess that I know. But what it seems like is we are hot right now. India is hot. And unless we shoot ourselves, I think we'll continue to stay hot. That's all I know.
And Puneet, I know that you've had capital raises, you've had expansion at this time, so there's been a lot going on at IHCL. We don't have to get into it, but from that standpoint, things are still looking good.
Yeah, it's that famous saying, half empty or half full. And I think every crisis has its opportunity. And to Ritesh's point, it's not just domestic tourism. As an example, the hospitality sector globally, not just in India, had a once-in-a-100-year opportunity to adjust its cost base. The people who thought they were champions of cost optimization suddenly realized they could do with half the cost. So it's not about, I'm not talking about a particular company, but when we sit in our circles and speak about it, is that really necessary or is it just nice to have? So over several decades, you just keep collecting. So I think the base has been adjusted, and if the budget actually achieves the growth percentages that we have envisaged, then we are in a very good space. If on top of that, during the year, some of the other instruments are leveraged, then we are in an excellent space. And I am personally a believer that wait 6 to 12 months. We have had that in few phases in October to 22nd of December. And we had it also just before the second wave hit us, as if there was no stopping. And the industry was on its own, it was doing quite well. I have no doubt in my mind that it's going to come back. It's like a plastic ball. Because of lockdown, you push it underwater that you're not allowed to come up. It's fine. The moment you release it, it just comes back up. So I remain actually outside, Vinayak told me to say cautiously optimistic. But in another context. So I think I stay optimistic.
But one thing that did happen, of course, we all were forced to become more efficient, but it came at human cost. So many people lost their jobs because our efficiency, a large part of it came from trimming the fat in our manpower. So human capital has suffered. So I'm not sure, because one would say that to feed a family of 4, it only costs you 20,000 rupees a month. So if you give somebody a job, you have actually lifted the bottom. So I think that we should be careful in the sense that there is such a thing as, I think it was one of the India Today conclaves, this gentleman guy standing gave this concept of precariats. And not very many people, I hadn't heard of it myself till that day. And not many people still appreciate it. But the more we create this distress at the bottom, everything else will become wobbly. So I think that's why I was saying that we should not celebrate yet. We should say, yes, we are on the right path, but we have a lot of homework to do at the bottom. We see it on a daily basis.
And, even though this wasn't a populist budget, Vinayak, we are heading towards elections. So while people are hoping for, further scope and more announcements elaborating on some of what was announced this year, next year, as we get closer to election time, is there a possibility that once again the spending structure will get skewed?
No, I don't think so, because one of the more noticeable aspects of this budget was a relative, substantial absence of populism, particularly in the context of some major states going into elections. In the old days, you would have found the railway budget announcing 20 new trains, 3 new stops, specific giveaways for particular states. You saw none of that kind of populism in this budget, and I frankly deeply appreciate that. Going forward, I mentioned about consistency, and I think that this is a very good ground rule that has been set, saying it should be professional, it should be based on logic and no short-term populism. But looking ahead, now that we have all digested this big outlays on infrastructure, it leads to a fresh set of concerns. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll quickly say that project execution, the Ministry of Program Implementation has come up with statistics which are deadly, that there's a huge amount of project delays, 4.36 lakh crores. That's a little over even half the budget outlay, is the cost of delay. Then they're talking about capital coming in. There's huge problems in the PPP frameworks, which is why many bids have not gone through. So there's a big challenge in recasting PPP formats, which also the FM has alluded to in her speech. And the last point I want to say is, we may have, and I would be happy to pick up this point at future India Today and other conclaves, we may have a very peculiar situation in the country because we've reached a level of maturity in funding capability. What did Ritesh say just now? Capital is not a problem. Even in the infrastructure sector, we have reached the capacity to fund 22 lakh crores per annum, which is the NIP target per annum. The question is, by next year and the year after, are there enough projects? So creating a fresh project pipeline when you have reached a maturity of funding capability is the next challenge. But there will be a time to talk about those things.
All right. Ritesh, I have to ask, it's the question on everyone's mind always when, they're talking about startups. And we have several investors here and in our audience as well, as we broadcast this. Are we seeing a bubble? Is there a danger of a bubble? Will we see this end badly? And it's not, I'm asking you for the startup ecosystem, but of course it's also relevant to the stock markets where we are actually seeing a lot of these startups now listing. We've seen very volatile stock prices, and while the founders have remained firm in the fact that, they have a future plan and things are intact, it's a very natural question.
Yeah, look, I think first off, this is a completely new ecosystem or industry that's getting created, right? So naturally, within this, you will have high quality companies and you'll also have companies where there are some challenges. Good news is, like any new industry that's getting created, in the long term, it all comes to balance. You will have some noise, but you'll also have some great high quality companies here. You have to give it the time that it so deserves. It's a little bit like, nowadays cricket is the flavor of the season. So if you see cricketers, right, there's a lot of cricketers who hold promise, but there are opportunities that they can improve and there are challenges that they come with. The question is, 5 years later, can they consistently keep playing well and can potentially demonstrate leadership capabilities, improvements around themselves, which is on and off the field. So I think for the sake of India and for the sake of technological evolution, I believe that you'll see more high quality companies than noise around yourself. Still early days, but I'm confident you will see this improvement. And I hope that one company will definitely prove that to be true.
All right, we'll wait and watch, yes. I'm going to record this and everyone laughing, how?
Give it enough time.
Give it enough time. Okay, well, we have the Finance Minister joining us very shortly. So I want to just do a round of closing comments very quickly and just get a sense of maybe whether it's one takeaway from the budget or whether it's one question you'd still like to ask her from all of you. Vinayak.
My biggest takeaway from the budget is what I started my earlier remarks with, is I am appreciative of the consistency of the policy framework within which it has been constructed, which is, and Puneet also referred to him saying in business life also, you have choices, you have economic choices. I can do this, I can do this, I can go halfway. It has taken a very clear choice, and that choice is based on fundamental economic logic. So I give full marks to that.
All right. Dr. Trehan?
More funding for education and health, and bottom of the pyramid.
Ritesh?
I think two things. The first is when we make our company's budgets, one of the things I have always learned from some of the most successful companies outside, even by our own career, is big bets, making a few big investment decisions and making sure that you actively focus on delivering great results. It does look like this budget is putting infrastructure as a big bet. So my perspective is I like that strategy. Now the question is, what does that lead to outcomes in the upcoming years?
I wish the finance minister was here. She used a term in one of our interactions from Japanese called gamanzoyoi. I think Vinayak, Dr. Train and I were on that forum, which basically says we were, in the last 2 years, patient, perseverant, and resilient. And that provides a very good foundation for us to jump and, whether we revive or we thrive or we have one company or 100 companies making it big in the digital world with the help of infra and creating enough jobs to provide healthcare, skilling, increase the human capital, intellectual capital to become the top 3 countries on the globe.
Wonderful. So, apart from Dr. Trehan, who had a very, very clear view on some of the things that were lacking, I see that at least with the others on the panel, there was a silver lining and things that you're looking forward to going forward. And I hope we will also see that in healthcare, Dr. Trehan, with leaders like yourself at the helm and having a voice about what needs to be done. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us here today. A big round of applause, please.